social isolation in modern society. Social contacts are of utmost importance for the personal and communal well-being of people. Social contacts constitute an elementary human need, are a considerable source of support, and prove necessary for the integration and mutual commitment of people in society. Due to the processes of individualization and social fragmentation in modern Western societies, social contacts have come under increased pressure. Individuals are finding it increasingly hard to develop and maintain a meaningful personal network. More and more people can be characterized as socially isolated, experiencing feelings of loneliness or not participating in society. Although social isolation has serious repercussions on people and communities, knowledge about this phenomenon remains rather limited. Social isolation in modern society is the first multidisciplinary study to look at this issue. The book integrates relevant research traditions in the social sciences, brings together sociological theories of social network and psychological theories on the feelings of loneliness. Both traditions are embedded in research, with the result of a large-scale empirical study being used to describe the extent, nature, and divergent manifestations of social isolation. A new typology of social contacts is developed in order to take into account the number of network members and quality of social contacts measured in terms of feelings of loneliness. The book provides a clear insight into personal, social, and socio-economic causes and the consequence of social isolation. This book also contains concrete policy recommendations. Preface. Nowadays, social scientists and social politicians pay more and more attention to the private living conditions, such as health, education, and the upbringing of our children, as a breeding ground for individual well-being. This also applies to people's private social network. It seems a paradox, but in a society that emphasizes self-reliance and individual responsibility, people with an extended personal network are far better off than those who live in social isolation. However, there are reasons to believe that in modern society, more and more people are becoming socially isolated. Still, policy interventions are not pointed at dysfunctioning or absent private social networks. It seems social isolation is supposed to be consequences of other living problems, instead of regarding it as a serious issue in and of itself. Social isolation does not only evoke professional interest, everybody is familiar with examples of socially isolated people in their own environment. At the same time, the availability of an extended personal network is an obvious fact for most of us. This especially is a harrowing aspect of social isolation. In our view, social isolation is an important concern for our society, for individual citizens, for social organizations, and for social policy. We hope our broad statements of affairs may function as an X-ray of a core aspect of our social well-being and the social quality of our society. The research project that forms the basis of this book gave us the opportunity to elaborate on the issues mentioned above. Many issues were discussed in more than 3,000 face-to-face interviews. The richness of the data made it possible to give an idea about the scope and several forms of social isolation, to go into the relations between the functioning of someone's personal network and other aspects of personal and societal functions, such as life events, personal competence, health, participation, neighborhood conditions, and so on. With all of this, social isolation in modern society may stimulate further research and theoretical thinking and development of adequate intervention strategies to prevent social isolation. 1.1 Social isolation manifestations. Often, we hear news reports that a person has been found dead at home. The longer a death has remained unnoticed, the more attention such a report gets. The typical questions that journalists pose to neighbors are, did you know the deceased? Did you not notice that they are absent for quite a while? This type of news leaves us feeling uncomfortable. It raises questions about one's own street, neighborhood, and community. Could something like that happen here as well? In the summer of 2003, France was shocked by the number of people who had passed away alone during a heat wave that lasted several days. The informal network of family, friends, acquaintances, and neighbors was apparently insufficient or entirely absent, and the professional system was incapable of reacting adequately. There are other harrowing examples of social isolation in our modern society. We regularly read about single men and women who neglect themselves and their dwelling. In recent decades, the street scene in large cities has witnessed the increase of homeless people. The man who looks for food leftovers in garbage containers, the women who ramble through the streets mumbling to themselves. The sight of such people leads us to wonder how things got so far and whether nobody looks after these people anymore. These dramatic examples of socially isolated people raise the question whether we are dealing with just a small group of dropouts from society or whether this is just the tip of the iceberg. For the rest, might be fairly invisible. In other words, are there many more individuals in our society who, for all kinds of reasons, are cut off from the social and societal outside world? Another question. Are there specific categories for individuals who are more susceptible for social isolation? Examples might be older immigrants who never connect with the society in which they move, lone mothers who no longer see possibilities to participate in society or social life, or can social isolation affect any member of society? Can social isolation be specified as a personal risk, indeed a consequence of modern society? The different manifestations of social isolation become more poignant when you consider the major importance our society attaches to personal relationships and a rich social life. An expression of this would be our television programs, which can spotlight persons who want to enter into new relationships or restore broken ones. We have reality TV, which shows how people live with each other for several weeks or months and how relationships between them develop. Television viewers identify with these characters from the soap operas that come into our homes every day and seem to form as a surrogate for contacts with family and friends. The viewers are made part of the emotional highs and lows in the lives of the characters. The importance social relationships have acquired can also be seen in the blooming market of dating and matchmaking services, and the increased space of personal ads are taking in newspapers and dating websites. Also remarkable are the general appeal to people from organizations like the Salvation Army and non-commercial advertising on television to create civil awareness for lonely fellow human beings. 1.2 Social isolation, a phenomenon in our time. Is there reason to assume that in our modern times it has become much more difficult to make and maintain social contacts? And has the risk of social isolation grown? Are the consequences of individualization in our society among these risks? The individual is unquestionably more self-dependent and less able to fall back on traditional social bonds like church, neighborhood, family, work, political party, or labor union, since these have lost a great deal of meaning. Obviously, not all social bonds have disappeared, but the individualistic lifestyle has changed the character of society. The effects can be noticed in personal life, in the dealings between people, and in the general social environment. Whereas people used to have a limited number of relatively stable bonds: marriage, family, work, neighborhood, club life. Nowadays, there are relatively many fleeting bonds. The fairly small communities in which people used to live have made way for the multiplicity of social bonds within which people have to function. Within each of these bonds, people have to deal with different expectations and role patterns. In a certain sense, parallel to the individualization of Western societies, welfare states developed in the second half of the 20th century, mainly in Western Europe. Differences may indeed exist between the Scandinavian countries, England, the Netherlands, and Southern Europe, but everywhere, a more or less extensive system of public social benefit has been established that has made people less dependent on members of the community than they ever have been. All kinds of societal institutions now fulfill a role in people's social lives, as a result of which informal contacts between individuals has been partially formalized. In recent decades, many personal contacts have been replaced with institutional associations. These developments offer more freedom and possibilities for self-determination, but also require new skills. The disappearance of widespread social patterns and structures not only presents possibilities for emancipation, development, and self-government, but also entail great insecurities. In this context, Beck, back in 1986, speaks of the risk of individualization, risks that are more person-bound than the class-bound inequalities of other times. Whereas traditions and its related rules guided actions, these days people have to find their own way and choose from many possibilities available. Not everyone is equipped equally to do so. While for some people, the new situation produces more freedom and wealth in a variety of contexts, others feel lost in the midst of large-scale associations and the superficiality of contact patterns. Hence, individual freedom and vulnerability end up very close together. This is even more a case in recent decades, now that in Western Europe, welfare states and the social benefit system is undergoing a process of austerity. The cuts in professional care and welfare facilities are necessary. On the basis of the above-mentioned theoretical assumptions, we may assume that increased numbers of people are unable to keep themselves going and build a network of meaningful contacts around them. At the same time, government policy has made a great appeal to people's ability to cope independently, thus increasing the importance of good informal social networks and informal social support. 1.3. Social isolation. How does it happen? Although we assume that it has become more difficult to build and maintain meaningful social contacts, the importance of social contacts has in fact increased in terms of both personal and societal functioning. How come some people fail to build a stable and supportive network around them, while other people are successful? Is there social isolation caused by personal and societal factors, or is there a combination of both? People tend to imagine social isolation as a consequence of aging, long-term unemployment, or loss of a partner. Is it indeed mostly these life circumstances that can lead to societal and social isolation, or do other factors play a role? Could personal characteristics be instrumental in the emergence of social isolation, like a lack of self-respect or self-confidence and poor social skills that make entering into stable relationships with others more difficult? Perhaps other youth experiences or other life events, such as prolonged illness, affect people in such a way that their personal contacts are severely affected. For a growing number of citizens, the workplace has assumed an increasingly significant role when entering into meaningful social contacts. Increased participation in the labor market also ensures that building and maintaining a social network in the home situation and one's own living environment is under increased time pressure. The contacts established at work are often at the expense of contacts in the private sphere. We see this especially in the female portion of the population. For a long time, it was primarily women who maintained these social contacts with family, friends, and neighbors. The demand to participate in the labor process implies that their daily contacts, too, must compete with social contacts from their professional environment. Does this make those people who do not, indeed cannot, participate in the labor process, like the long-term unemployed or the disabled, better off or worse in terms of their social contacts? The living environment can also play a role in the emergence of social isolation. For many people, neighborhoods have acquired a different meaning than they used to, not only due to the increase in labor participation, but also because of the greater geographic mobility. It is therefore interesting to find out to what degree social isolation is associated with the local circumstances and the social environment. People, nowadays, assume that a social isolation is a typical phenomenon of big cities, as this is where you find the greatest cultural and ethnic diversity. Due to the heterogeneity of lifestyles and etiquettes, people in urban neighborhoods have less contact with each other than they used to. However, in recent decades, small communities have also undergone developments that could foster social isolation. The populations of many small towns have dropped significantly, and many local facilities have disappeared altogether. More and more residents have to leave their villages in order to participate in all kinds of social activities, for example, work, recreation, and entertainment, or use facilities like libraries or social work services. It is the less mobile groups in particular, the elderly, housewives, and households without a car, that experience the negative consequences of spatial scale increases and the concentration of such activities and facilities. Such outcomes make them more dependent on social networks and hence more vulnerable to social isolation. In addition to personal characteristics, life events, degree of social participation, and the modern neighborhood environment, the living situation of certain categories of people can also be identified as a factor in the emergence of social isolation. For example, a large-scale national study in the Netherlands showed that lone parent families have great difficulty with social contacts. Of the lone parents with low social positions, as many as 20% are socially isolated. Another factor is the precarious living situation of lone seniors who live by themselves. 1.4. Social isolation, a private matter or social problem. In addition to inquiring into the factors that play a role in the emergence of social isolation, there is another question: whether we should see social isolation as a private matter or a societal issue. Social contacts are important to people's personal and societal well-being. They increase self-respect and fulfill a key role in dealing with problems. People in somebody's social network can be more readily there for someone with problematic situations without giving problem accumulation a fighting chance. Moreover, social contacts have become more important for societal functionings. Persons from the social network can provide access to assorted societal resources like work and education. To belong, societally speaking, it is also necessary to have the right contacts and to network. The impact of personal well-being and threat to societal functioning can be reason enough to view social isolation as not exclusively a private matter, but also as a societal issue. Social networks, however, are also relevant when seen from the perspective as society as a whole. People who are part of social networks are more active in societal life. They participate more in clubs, provide more informal care, and do more volunteer work, and are more involved in all kinds of societal organizations. This is important to society because this societal participation forms as a feeding ground for social activity and involvement with the weaker and dropouts of society. In a different way, social isolation can also constitute as a threat to social cohesion and solidarity within society. The intrusive way in which the socially isolated drifters, homeless, and junkies in neighborhoods and urban centers manifest can be experienced as a direct threat by others of the public domain. Less visible forms of social isolation do not seem to be directly unfavorable to social cohesion, but if people are no longer part of regular society, they can also lose contact with the norms and values prevailing in the society, values that are essential for social integration and societal stability. What happens with people who cannot meet the demands of individualization and complex society makes of them? Those who do not participate in the labor process are unable to build a supportive network in their private life. These individuals end up outside of society in a social as well as societal sense. Furthermore, this category of people who cannot manage on their own are not assertive enough to present their interests and needs to professional agencies. They alienate their social and societal environment, and their bonds with it keep dwindling. Social isolation could therefore be designated as a new form of social inequality. 1.5. Social isolation, a theme for social policy. If, in addition to psychological factors, societal circumstances also play a role in the emergence of social isolation problems, as the consequences of social isolation do not only affect the individual, but also cause societal disruption, one should expect social isolation to be an important theme of social policy. However, until now, social isolation has received little policy-related attention. Most of the focus in social policy at the local level still lies on battling societal disadvantages and thus material issues. Important focal points are work, income, education, and the neighborhood environment. Governments tend to emphasize societal participation and the assumed active involvement of citizens. Next, to these classic disadvantage indicators, more recent goals of social policy, under the denominators of ability to cope independently, personal responsibility, and mutual autonomy, have been defined mainly in the light of societal participation and active involvement. Must the government also create conditions to strengthen the social competency of individuals so that people can have a properly functioning personal network? Or can it make do with offering a safety net for those who do not make it on their own? Can practicing professionals in the sphere of care and welfare provide adequate answers to these problems when confronted with social isolation. Primary physicians and social workers are under enormous pressure. They usually lack the means to give extra time and attention to these clients if they come into contact with them at all. Mental health institutes are oriented specifically towards severe mental problems. Institutions such as the Social Services Department, neighborhood police, housing corporations, and municipal health services only intervene after the situation has taken extreme form. For example, if public health or the public order is threatened. Still, attention to social competency and properly functioning social networks could sometimes prove to be a decisive condition or point of reference for the success of assistance in other areas of life. In terms of social policy, more knowledge about the social isolation allows for better recognition of the value of preventative interventions, anticipation of risk factors, and relief or elimination of social isolation that is already there. 1.6 Research Aim. Given the developments in society, it is possible that the problems of social isolation may worsen further. Changed relationship patterns, increasing numbers of inactive people, higher demands on social competence, and greater cultural and ethnic diversity, crumbling social bonds, problems bringing up youth. All these issues influence people's social functioning. Despite all these signals, little is known at this point about the nature and scope of social isolation. There isn't even an unambiguous definition of social isolation, although much research has been done in recent years into loneliness and social isolation. It has focused mainly on familiar high-risk groups like seniors, the long-term unemployed, and people with poor health. A wide and systematic study into the nature, scope, causes, and consequences of social isolation is missing. Social isolation in modern society attempts to interpret these aspects of social isolation. We have deliberately chosen information of the average population. Hence, the book does not report on social isolation and among specific groups like the homeless, drug addicts, or illegal aliens. It mainly provides a glimpse into the lives of ordinary, normal citizens. We have also limited ourselves to personal social networks. Contacts of a functioning or fleeting nature do not belong here. Feelings of loneliness or the urge to retreat into oneself for a while are part of human nature. In this study, we do not deal with temporary but with structural forms of social isolation. The book not only examines social isolation, but also provides insight into the lives of people who, socially speaking, are competent. The aim of this study is to gain insight into the nature, scope of social isolation in modern Western society, and to the background as well as the causes and consequences of this phenomenon. Individuals and societal aspects of social isolation will be discussed extensively. To realize these aims, the following questions are formulated. 1. What are the scope and nature of social isolation? 2. What individual and societal causes are behind it? 3. What are the consequences of social isolation for the individual and the social well-being of individuals? 4. What can the insights of this study mean for theories on social isolation? 5. How can these insights have an effect on policy on social isolation? The research questions are answered on the basis of data from a major survey project, Social Isolation in the Netherlands, which took place between 1995 and 1998, at the initiative of the Dutch Ministry of Health, Welfare and Sports. The project was executed in 4 Dutch municipalities, including 2 large cities, Amsterdam and Utrecht, and 2 rural areas, Benemas and Het Odenbed. 1.7 Method. The study was carried out in the forms of oral survey, gathering data in 2 phases. When compiling the extended questionnaires, use was made of the various data sources. Prior to the composition of the questionnaire, key informants in all the research locations were consulted, such as public servants, professionals working in healthcare and welfare institutions, and volunteers who have knowledge of and experience with different facets of social isolation. Use was also made of policy documents, existing statistic data, and specialized literature. Based on this different information resource, the questionnaire was developed. In the first phase of the study, 2,462 persons were interviewed in a face-to-face setting. The questionnaire used here consisted largely of items with pre-coded answer categories. Next is several general questions about the background and living situation of the respondents. Questions were included about the social contacts maintained by the residents, the evaluation of these social contacts, for example, in terms of loneliness, the mutual exchange of help and support, health, any hindrances in daily functioning, and the use of facilities. There were also questions on societal and neighborhood factors, like participation in society, social contacts in one's social environment, views on neighborhood and attachment to one's neighborhood. An important part of this first survey concerns a series of questions to map out the social network of the respondents. This was done using the exchange approach of Fisher, which attempts to find out the persons with whom respondents regularly undertake concrete activities and/or from whom they expect support. The quality of these social contacts was determined with a validated loneliness scale. Appendix 1 offers an overview of the topics of the first questionnaire. In the second phase of the study, an in-depth interview was taken of a smaller group of residents, consisting of 460 individuals, selected from the first group. The second questionnaire focuses mainly on personal factors such as personal competence, life attitude, and socialization. The questionnaire also contains questions about important life events, the support people have found in such situations, and the consequences for the social network and social participation. It also asks about protective factors, uplifts, and sources of comfort. A self-evaluation scale for depression has also been included. Finally, questions are asked about respondents' satisfaction with all kinds of factors of their life, such as work, living situation, health, leisure activities, and having or lacking a partner, children, and friends. Appendix 2 offers an overview of the subjects of the second questionnaire. Information about the specific items will be further explained in the corresponding chapters. The study group was compared on several points with the total Dutch population aged 18 and older. Sex, age, marital status, living situation, ethnicity, and education. When comparing the respondents in the first phase of the study with the total Dutch population, the sample does not seem to show significant deviations from the total population in terms of the distribution of men and women. The sample is also representative of the total Dutch population for ethnicity. The sample shows no significant differences, whether with regard to the total population in terms of age distribution. The sample does show significant deviations from the total Dutch population in civil status and living situation. Married people are underrepresented in the sample, whereas divorced and widowed individuals are overrepresented. The deviations in the living situation can be explained partially by the way this variable is composed. The data of the population only refers to persons who are part of a private household, what is known as the institutional population, i.e., people who have been staying for at least 1 year in nursing homes, homes for the elderly, convalescent homes and children homes, boarding schools, rehabilitation centers, and prisons are not included. This excludes at least 2% of the total Dutch population aged 18 and older from this classification. The sample does not include persons who are staying in institutions. They fall under the other group, which is hence considerably larger, 9%, than the total Dutch population, 1%. Of course, the disproportionately high number of old people in the sample also contributes in this larger difference. The share of lone parent families is equal for the sample and the total population. The main differences are found in the share of persons living in single households and those living in shared households. The sample has relatively more singles and less people from multi-person households than in the total Dutch population. The share of singles is closely connected with the degree of urbanization of the various research locations. In the urban areas, Amsterdam and Utrecht, the number of singles is considerably higher, respectively 33% and 40%, than in the rural areas. It is not possible to determine the representativeness of the sample on the basis of education levels of the respondents because the data in the sample cannot be properly compared with the data from the total population. The data on the educational levels of the total population is available only for the working population, defined as persons between the ages of 15 and 64 who work at least 12 hours per week or are available 12 hours per week for the labor market. The sample was drawn from all those individuals aged 18 and older. The classification used is the same in both cases: lower, secondary, and higher education, including university and higher vocational education. The relatively high number of persons with a lower and secondary education in the sample can be explained by the fact that 18% of the sample is in the 65 and older category, a group whose general educational level is lower than other age categories. To conclude, we can determine that the study group of the first research phase corresponds on several important points with the total Dutch population. The respondent group is in any event representative in terms of men-women ratio, age distribution, and ethnicity of the respondents. The sample differs significantly from the total population in marriage status and living situation, although the ratio between single households and common households is comparable with the ratio within the total Dutch population. The representativeness on the basis of education cannot be determined. As expected, the small sample in the second research phase shows more significant deviations than the larger sample. Only the distribution of men and women and the ethnicity correspond with the distribution in the total Dutch population. The frequency distribution of the background data shows significant deviations from the total population. The representativeness of this sample will be further discussed in Chapter 13. The findings in the following chapters relate to the data sets of the large and small sample. In the analysis, we have clearly indicated which data sets the data was derived from. 1.8 Structure of the book. In addition to this chapter, Part 1 of this study consists of 3 further chapters. In Chapter 2, we start presenting the main concepts and theories that are related for the study of social contacts in general and social isolation in particular. Views on social relationships and the meaning of personal networks are discussed for both the personal lives of people and from a societal perspective. We also find out how social relationships are shaped in these times and what it is meant when people become socially isolated. Chapter 3 presents new typology of social contacts in which network size as well as quality of social contacts are taken into account in terms of feelings of loneliness. Based on these social contact typologies, we describe 4 groups. 1 socially competent group, 2 groups risking social isolation, and 1 group that is actually socially isolated. In chapters 4 to 9, part 2, we discuss different possible causes of social isolation. 1 subject is central per chapter, and its relation with social contact typology and social isolation is investigated. The personal factors that may play a role in the emergence of social isolation are life events, personal competence, and health. We also look at the relation between social network and dependence on professional facilities. We then examine several societal factors, societal participation, and the neighborhood. Part 3 consists of 3 chapters. Chapter 10 focuses on the comparison between urban and non-urban areas. We find out whether clear differences exist between the social world of citizens in more urban areas as against small communities in rural areas. Chapter 11 summarizes the main findings. We examine the relative importance of the different factors in terms of social isolation. The factors that were discussed in previous chapters are interrelated here and analyzed in this context. In Chapter 12, we further distinguish the 4 basic types of our constructed social contact typologies into several interesting and unexpected subcategories, which with its own profile. Here, we look at the relation between our social contact typology, personal competence, and societal participation, and the individual and societal well-being of respondents. The study is concluded in part 4 with 2 chapters. Chapter 13 consists a method and theory review. We take a critical look at the research methods and questionnaires used and discuss the relevance of the results of modern Western society. We also show the points of reference that existing theories on subjective well-being and social networks offer for the study of social isolation and how our research can make a contribution. Chapter 14 sketches the contours of social policy aimed at preventing and reducing social isolation. In addition to new policy vision, we make recommendations for intervention strategies.